Welcome back, you filthy exiles. So I've now spent quite a number of hours grinding through maps in the endgame, probably about 50 plus now. Be it I've not reached T15s yet, and I'm getting there. Warrior is hard, to say the least, and not hard as in hard, it's just not as zoomy as like the other metas that are out there right now. And if you're playing one of those metas, like the Sork class or gas grenades or something like that, don't you start telling me to get good. Anyway, from my experience and time with the endgame so far, there's definitely a lot of flaws to the endgame, and that comes from me playing thousands of hours of Path of Exile 1, hundreds upon hundreds of hours of Last Epoch, and also a number of other games that I've played through into the endgame, even Titan Quest originally, right? The problems that I see there are things to me that preclude to the fact that it's just deliberate design to slow the player down, and it's not design that makes the game hard. It just makes the game frustrating and unfun, and it's unnecessary, i.e. towers, for example. Anyway, I thought we'd sort of dig into a few of these critiques, and this is my experience, right, and my view of it. If you disagree, you're perfectly welcome to. If you think it's the most fun endgame ever, more power to you. But that being said, I felt I'd express some of the things that concern me about the game currently, and be it the game is going to change a lot, hopefully over the coming months into the next year. I definitely think it's very far away from where it needs to be from an endgame standpoint. Obviously, it's early access, missing a ton of content, but what it has right now, if the foundation isn't right, then everything that's added in subsequently is not going to fix the foundational problems with it. Also, that being said, I've seen a lot of other creators that have put in their sort of 2 cents worth, and I agree with a large number of their critiques as well around this. So I'm not alone in what I'm saying. I do feel there's still a bit of overhype in a lot of elements, and I think that's not really taking into consideration that there are flaws that isn't early access or a beta, and so things do need to change to make sure the game is constructed in such a way that the player base will stay for the longest duration. If everybody simply just says it's perfect from the get-go and nobody comes back in 6 to 12 months, well, it clearly wasn't perfect, right? And on that note, if you haven't liked and subbed to the channel, or just subbed to the channel, make sure you consider clicking that button down below. Now, overall, I like to provide a fair critique and a no BS approach critique, right? So I'm not going to be like hype manning stuff or anything like that. I'm just going to call things like they are. As I said earlier, if you disagree, you disagree. But yeah, there are definitely both positives and negatives to the Path of Exile 2 endgame right now. But anyway, let's talk about some of these observations. Now, in relation to the overall mapping system, I do like it. I think it's good. I think it's fresh and innovative, and it definitely has the ability to go far. It's very reminiscent of Delve, as we already sort of discussed earlier on in the piece, and sort of reminds me of Last Epoch. In a way, I sort of like Last Epoch's corruption system, just a touch more, but I guess I played a bit more of Last Epoch's endgame than I have of Path of Exile 2's at this stage, so the more I play a Path of Exile 2, I'll get more use of it over time, right? That's like anything new, you just got to play it more and more. Now, overall, just some like positive points. I like the way the overall Atlas works. I like the Citadel system, be it there is some sort of gating behind the map level that you need to run Citadels with. And overall, like early on, it's fun to get into. But that's the problem. It's fun early on, not so much later down the track. Now, in comparison to Path of Exile 1's mapping system, and I know people have their reservations about that, I actually personally preferred Path of Exile 1's mapping system. And the reason for that is it gave you a lot more control over your progression into the endgame. And there are tons of players that never got to higher tier maps. Now, obviously, the thing a lot of people say is it is easier. Well, I'd argue and say that the same people who are struggling with Path of Exile 2 are probably going to struggle with Path of Exile 1 similarly. I don't necessarily think it's easier, it's just dependent on the mods, right? And there was a lot of power creep in Path of Exile 1. So if you looked at it tit for tat, it's about equal difficulty to a degree of it. Now, there are some people that dislike the Path of Exile 1 mapping system, but I just felt like it was easier to progress through to the end game. Now, there wasn't really like unnecessary things that we'll talk about below that hinder you. It's not necessarily the mapping system unto itself. It's just the things that slow the progression that have been added in the Path of Exile 2. Not the difficulty, funnily enough. It's actually not the difficulty that's a problem. It's just there's bloat that doesn't need to be there. One of the other things in Path of Exile 1, I did sort of now look back at it, and I like the Scarab system versus to, where they get to now. And the reason for that is the Scarab system allowed you to play mechanics that you wanted to specialize in. Now you sort of got to play whatever you get dealt. And it's very RNG based. It just feels like you're not in control of the reins of the end game. But that being said, being fair to the game, it's a brand new game if we look at it for being a new game. So what the hell is going on in my... There's a lot of lights out there. It's a brand new game at the end of the day, so it'll develop over time. But Path of Exile 1 had a lot of time to refine itself in that way. And so, yeah, Path of Exile 1 feels a lot more targeted, and it's a tighter end game versus what I'm seeing so far with Path of Exile 2. But with more playtime, I'll get better at it, and I feel like my opinion may change over time. I do like Citadels. Citadels are really cool. They're just cities out of Delve, to be honest with you. But I don't like how they're gated towards higher tier maps, like tier 15 maps. I feel like they need to be dropped, so you can do them at whatever tier you want to put a map into and do them, because I feel like you should be able to do them and get really good drops, which is similar to how Delve works. You hit a city and you'd get fantastic drops in there, so you'd be working to get to Citadel, but maybe I just haven't progressed that far enough yet. Anyway, those are some of the critiques about the overall mapping system, so let's drill down a little more. Okay, so Lost Towers. I straight up dislike this system. I don't think this is a good mechanic, and I think it forces you to burn a map to progress, to see more things on the atlas in the fog of war, when really, like, you should just sort of unlock the atlas as you go. And that's similar to how Delve and Path of Exile 1 works. You just keep going and going and going, and there's a flow to it. And this same comment's been rippled through from a lot of other creators and a lot of other people. Lost Towers are just, they don't really serve a point. Like, they can be there to be able to put in stones to be able to buff up other maps and whatnot. And I feel like even that is really RNG, depending on the maps that it hits within the vicinity. But I feel like there's just like, these have just been added in by the devs to deliberately hinder your progress in getting to the next map. And they just don't need to be in the game. So this would be a strike where I'd say, like, yeah, Lost Towers, not really necessary at the end of the day. Like, it's not a skill thing, it's not a anything thing. You get a bit of progress from it if you punch a map into it. It's easier to progress if you're struggling through the maps as you're sort of leveling them. But overall, there's not a lot of point to them, and they don't really drop very much. They're like a short form map. They're like the ARAM of a League of Legends game, and it just makes no sense unless you just really enjoy doing them for some reason. I don't know why, but anyway, no, towers just don't need to be in the game. The next one's going to be a bit of a contentious one, and I've got a video I'm going to do which will help players if they're struggling in this, because I definitely was early, and I still am a little bit, but I got better at it, is rarity and map drop rates. So one of the most painful parts of the endgame right now, I've found, is just sustaining maps to such a degree that I've basically had to resort to going to the market and trading for them. Now, the other problem is currency farm as well. Now, unless you're running like a really 1% of 1% build, or like a super meta that can just blast through and zoom, guess what? You can't really put a lot of rarity gear on your character, because you need to gear your character to be able to survive that higher content, right? So you are really hindered where builds that just simply rely on really good skills that are really balanced, excel, and everything else is just like you're always chasing your tail. Unfortunately, this makes Path of Exile 2 in the endgame feel like Path of Exile 1. This is exactly how Path of Exile 1 felt. Basically, people who could put a cheese build together could do super juice content, and they could just blast the game, and everybody else would be left in their wake. And that's fine, like, there's a place for that, but I feel like in Path of Exile 2, it sort of defeats the entire purpose of what Path of Exile 2 is about. I feel like also on the other side of the spectrum, when you're going into mapping, there should be a more consistent drop. Like, I don't even care if exalts aren't dropping more consistently, but like map drops, or sorry, waystone drops should be significantly more consistent without having to juice over 300% on your waystone drop rate. Like if you're at 100%, you should be getting a few waystones, and it's also really random to the waystones that you do get. So like, I don't necessarily know how the rarity works in that respect, but the probability of getting higher waystones depending on the map seems to just go to crap whenever you're in like a T9 map and you're getting like T2 and T3 waystones dropping. And if I compare this to Path of Exile 1 in mapping, like that happened to an element of it, but more than often you had a better probability as you progressed to get more maps of a higher tier or equivalent tier. And or you could play a mechanic and then just get, this is where the Citadels could be really good, where you could farm a Citadel out and get a ton of map drops, and that could progress your next run of maps, right? That's just a suggestion. That's how Delve works. But this is one of the biggest complications I've found with trying to progress the endgame, is it's really slow if you're playing not a meta build. And I just find this is an unnecessary limiter. And I know like the comment that they made was they don't want to give too much to the player, because if they give too much, they can't take things back. But I feel like this isn't a huge thing to give the player. Like this isn't a huge advantage. It's just progression. And this is one of the things that right now I'm finding to be the most unfun sort of part of the game, where I've got to go and buy maps. And I haven't had to buy maps in Path of Exile since I was first getting into Path of Exile 1 endgame mapping, and then realized there were tons of mechanics to get good map drops. I don't know. Open to comments below about this one, but I feel like this is just a bit of a grind point right now. Once you get to that point where you can sustain that rarity, by the way, it's okay. But in those earlier maps, it's just not in the favor of the player, and a lot of people are going to struggle to get to T15 as a result. Okay, bosses. Now, my understanding of Path of Exile 2 was that bosses were supposed to be hard. And I'm not talking about like pinnacle bosses. Like we know pinnacle bosses are hard, right? They're pinnacle bosses. They're supposed to be the upper echelon of the boss, cream of the crop of bosses, right? However, the bosses on the actual Atlas, super easy. Like, I am even at like T10, I'm geared at level 80. I do good damage, everything. I don't really struggle with bosses. Like, I don't blow them up in 2 seconds, but it doesn't take very long for me to, mace strike them. After 10 mace strikes, they're dead. This feels counterintuitive to the entire design ethic behind Path of Exile 2. So, the biggest challenge I actually find in Path of Exile 2 in the endgame mapping is just white monster packs, to be honest with you. Like, they're unnecessarily overtuned. It's not a difficulty problem as far as, like, my skill ability to take them down. It's just like, why? Like, I would have felt like the map bosses would have been a significantly higher amount of difficulty. And I actually prefer to fight the map bosses, are much easier to fight than the white packs 9 times out of 10, which I just find totally defeats the purpose. So this is one of the things I find frustrating around progressing in Path of Exile 2, because really, like, you just slowed down by the trudge through white packs, as opposed to going after those big bosses that should be a challenge. Like, and the big thing around where people were like, oh, I remember the boss name and stuff like that, and it was such a challenge. Well, that's in the campaign, right? And that was like the first like 10% of the game, if that you'll play. And after so much time, you're going to forget those boss names anyway. They're not going to be memorable anymore, because fundamentally, when you get to the end game, you want to have that same experience that you had through the campaign, where the bosses are really challenging. And that's not really happening right now. Quite often, too, as a result of the white packs that are in maps, they just like overcrowd you. They push you around. Like if you're running a skill like Stampede, I actually noticed when you get a speed shrine, Stampede works properly. So it's been tuned to be way too slow in the first place, but like then you get pushed around by these white packs, and then you get corralled around. And I know they said like, oh, if you get crowded, then you're screwed, but also then your dodge roll doesn't work. So is it a skill problem when you've got too many white pack enemies that are overtuned, just belting on you? And I know it's a positioning thing, but it sort of feels like unnecessary frustration when you can go fight a end map boss that's like, you know, going to take 5-6 hits and they're going to go down and you're going to get a really good reward out of it. You don't even get much reward out of taking down white and magic packs as well. So I feel like there is a real balance issue between the significance of bosses versus packs in maps. Now, the answer could be to make the bosses harder, but then you don't really address the problem with map packs being just a total grind 9 times out of 10. So there's definitely some issues. And again, it comes back to cheese builds don't really have an issue with this, but like every other skill that doesn't perform as well as like the optimum few skills that are currently being abused right now are sort of at a massive disadvantage. And again, like, is that, like, that's just basically Path of Exile 1 all over again, isn't it? The next one is map size and backtracking. There's no reason why you need to deliberately have players backtrack through maps, right? It's this mechanic is not a skill thing. Big maps just lack the flow that they need to have. They just unnecessarily slow players down. And also, you've got a lot of things that are slowing the player down anyway. You might have temporal chains. Players really don't move very quickly in the first place. You've got no, like, you know, actual movement mechanics in the game outside of dodge roll. So, like, it slows down the end game, but artificially so. It's not a real slow to the end game. It's not like a progression slow to the end game. It's just like extending the amount of time that you have to do something, not something that's mechanically more tumultuous or tenuous. To me, it just feels like an overstep to create an artificial pacing reduction, and it just doesn't need to be the case. If I look at like Path of Exile 1, maps had a really succinct flow to them. Like you'd blast the map through, right? So on, so on. It would take longer in that initial level up, right? As you're getting the gear you need and progressing and everything. And then you get to the boss at the very end and you might get one clap by that boss and you know, okay, I've screwed up. Or I don't have the gear to do this yet. So you come back to it and you do it again. And you're like, all right, cool. But it had a really good feel to the initial game speed. And this is before you get to the zoom zoom stage. The zoom zoom stage doesn't start straight away. That's like when you get really geared up, when you're in like T15 and 16 and whatnot maps. At the moment, Path of Exile 1 like just doesn't have that right level of pacing tuned out as far as maps go. So like number 1, too big. And then backtracking, like running back through an empty map again just isn't really the feel of a challenge. It's just like, oh, now I've got to go find the corner on the opposite end of the map that I ran past that has that one last boss just hiding in it. And that just frustrates play. It just takes away from the fun, right? Because you want to progress, you want a bit of flow to the end game and how it works. This just breaks that flow up, doesn't make it a lot of fun, just makes it really unenjoyable, and it just makes it tedious at the end of the day. So this is like one of my other critiques, and I have one last one, which I guess is the biggest one of it all. Okay, so the last thing that I've got a bit of a gripe with in the end game for Path of Exile 2 is one death on maps when you have 6 portals. There's no reason for that. So you have an XP penalty already, and that XP penalty grows over time as you progress through maps, right? So I'm totally okay with an XP penalty. It was 10% in Path of Exile 1, it's like 15% in Path of Exile 2. I think that's fair. If you screw up, you should incur a penalty and 15% XP. I'm okay with that. I can live with that. It means I screwed up, I hit the wrong button, something like that. I didn't get good, as people like to say now. So yeah, you get a penalty and that's enough. But for it to totally brick your map is the worst case scenario, and it goes beyond just the XP loss. The frustration of it, yes, is number 1. But losing that map when you already have a very scarce resourcing of maps and pooling of maps in the first place, and their price is significant, is a significant penalty. It's just not like you're penalizing the character, the player, for dying with the XP penalty, then you're penalizing them again just for existing basically with this mechanic. There is no real reason why you can't have 6 portals to use. Like, and it doesn't make sense. It's like, why put 6 portals in the map? Put 1 portal. And like the reason being is like, oh, okay, well, you know, it should be more challenging and rah, 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 and you have to go back and get mana top up and stuff like that. Well, when you start progressing, and that doesn't matter because you can generate that stuff within the map, so it makes no difference having that mechanic. So that's like a campaign mechanic they're trying to carry into mapping, which doesn't really work. And then beyond that point, it's just like, okay, well, if you die once, you're going to lose that map, and you're going to lose the benefit of doing the actual waystone, right? That's fine, or the map on the Atlas, but at least don't brick the whole map. Like, take away the benefit. And that's how Last Epoch works. So you can go back into that map, run it again, or back into the Echo, run it again, and you just walk out with no, you know, less loot, the boss goes away, or whatever it is, and that's perfectly fine. You can continue to progress. I feel like the one death penalty just, it doesn't need to exist. It's unnecessary. It's just unnecessarily slowing progression down. And if you're gonna do that, make map drops more available to players, so that losing a map isn't so significant and painful. It's like you're getting penalized in 3 different angles here. You're losing the progress. You know, you're losing the map. You're losing the progress, and you're also losing XP. And it's like, at a certain point, that just becomes unfun. Like, if you die enough times, and quite often with builds, you have to die in order to get lessons, right? There's always hardcore players out there that are like, you know, balancing constantly or whatever, and that's fine, that's the thing. But for the most of, you know, most players, like, dying is a lesson, and then you learn from that lesson, you gear around fixing or balancing or whatever. But dying and losing a map and losing progress is just totally frustrating to the player at the end of the day. Anyway, these are like my critiques over the endgame right now. Like, overall, I sort of covered off on a lot of negatives here. I know, and I'm very well aware of that. The endgame's not bad. It's just not good right now. Like, there's a lot of things that don't make sense, and I feel like at a certain degree, there's like stuff that was just added in to just slow the player down deliberately, not from a skill standpoint, but just deliberate, like, time required. And quite frankly, I don't agree with that stance. Like, things just shouldn't take longer because they take longer. They should take longer because there's a risk and reward that needs to come from it. So if you're doing a harder bit of content, it shouldn't be running around a bigger map or whatever it is. It should be, it's harder, so you got to be more mechanically adept to do the content or whatnot. But right now, there's a lot of elements of the endgame that just don't feel like that when you're just doing general mapping, and it just takes away from the overall flow of the game. It just makes it, you know, a lot less fun. Anyway, if you like this video, and whether you disagree or agree with my critiques, yeah, drop a like and a sub below. And I will see you guys in future videos. I am going to do a video, I think, about how to improve your drop rates, because I did sort of work with that today, and I came up with some tips that helped me, and I'm going to share that. So yeah. Anyway, I'll see you guys later, and have a good one.